Awesome. And so, hello to everyone who is tuning in. I'm Carmen Rios. I'm a feminist writer and broadcaster and digital strategist, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm here today with Anna, who I will introduce in full in a minute. And I just want to start the conversation today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which I'm gathering here in LA, the Tongva tribe and their elders, past and present. As we gather in a connected community online, and I know that a lot of you are signing in from all over the place, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country, the indigenous people and their elders. I also want to name that I am holding hope as we are talking about this digital space and this community, that my highest intention is that our words and language today don't cause harm to each other or to anyone tuning in, and I'll be holding that intention throughout. And so before we get started, I want to introduce our esteemed guest, Anna Boden. Anna, with her creative partner, Ryan Fleck, is the executive producer and director of Mrs. America. And when they co-wrote and directed Captain Marvel together, Anna also became the first woman director in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is so badass and cool. And so much of what we talk about at the Jane Club is honoring the work of women and recognizing the paid and unpaid labor that women do, how undervalued our time is, how many spaces we hold. And so taking time right now to share her knowledge and insight with this community is no small feat. So Anna, I'm honored that you would share your time with us here today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to, chat with you all about a show that was really fun to work on and also illuminating to me.
Totally. And, if anyone has questions while we're chatting, just go ahead and you can just pop them into the chat. You can chat me privately if you want to. And we'll get to them at the end, or we might get to them in the conversation. But I did want to sort of I always start with an inception story. So, I have been covering the ERA for a lot of years as sort of a journalist, as an editor at Ms. And I know a lot about it, but I also know that the story of the ERA fight in the 70s is massive. It contains so many multitudes. And I just really loved the way the story was told, but I'm also just curious about sort of where this project begins. Where do you enter? How does it look? What did it look like to build this show from the bottom up?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll start by saying that I didn't build it from the bottom up. It came to me already as a script. The really wonderful writer, Davi Waller, wrote these, had written the first two scripts and had an outline for the whole series when she sent it to me and Ryan. And I was not looking for something to jump into right away. I was deep in the editorial process on Captain Marvel, and I had just been working straight for 2 years. I felt like I hadn't seen my family for 2 years, and all I was looking for was like a long nap afterwards. But it caught my attention because of the subject matter, the world it was exploring, and also because it was exploring that world through this really unusual lens of following Phyllis Schlafly on the one hand, who I'd only known as kind of the anti-hero in the history that I knew, which wasn't that much. I didn't know very much about her. She was more like a footnote in history for me. And then also on the other hand, these extraordinary women who I did know a little bit more about, but not nearly as much as I would have thought that I should know about them. And so being able to kind of tackle the subject matter through that lens and through these two really different worlds at a time when in the 1970s, when these two cultures were really colliding, and in a way that really smartly in the writing spoke to where we are now. in a really smart way that didn't feel like it was hitting me over the head with it, but with every kind of choice of where to follow and what these women are talking about and how they're talking, kind of just triggered some emotional response to either the conversations we're still having and how are we still having these conversations, and also in a really smart way, realizing how things had changed, how culture had shifted, and not only in positive ways. So I guess the scripts are what drew me to the project, and also that Kate Blanchett was going to be playing Phyllis Schlafly, who, you know, is kind of a superhero. and then we got involved kind of early on in the prep process when we were still casting, and Ryan and I ended up directing about half the episodes. We kind of started the project, hired some directors to tell some of the other episodes, and then we finished it up, and we all kind of worked in really close collaboration with each other.
Awesome. And yeah, I mean, I was also extremely struck by how much in the show had not changed, how many of the themes were sort of just still very resonant, right? Like intergenerational disagreements in feminism, and you know, Phyllis Schlafly working with white supremacists to grow her power on the right, and Bella making these pragmatic choices that we always hear have to be made, but also obviously we can sort of see now, right? Like 40, 50 years later, the ways in which they set us up to keep a lot of women disempowered for a lot longer. And all of this stuff is still happening, right? We're still fighting about what our priorities should be and how big we should dream. And we're still watching a lot of anti-feminists band together in a lot of unholy alliances. But what lessons and warnings did you feel like the characters had to offer for this current moment in time?
Well, you know, before I came onto the project in a world in which, you know, Trump had been elected to the presidency. I think like I got the script right around the Kavanaugh hearings. So it was like a very different world than when it started to be written, because I believe, you know, from what Davi told me, she was writing it before the election when she thought that, you know, the world was going to look quite different. And you know, so for me, it was a different experience coming onto the project than maybe it was for her writing it. But for me, it was important not only to kind of see how the feminist movement, all kind of the complicated messiness of that and where that went, but also try to understand the other side. Because it was, you know, in 2016, coming off the election, you know, sitting and looking at each other and being like, how'd we get here? Do you know what I mean? That's kind of, it tuned into that for me in a certain way, that question of like, how did we get here? Who are these people who are so scared of change? And so it was interesting to see the way that Phyllis Schlafly was portrayed, which is kind of like a very Trumpian character in a certain way, the way that she uses emotion and like wedge issues to gain support for something that it's like I'm always trying to understand how much of this does she believe and how much is she using it. And there's no clear answer. And I think it would be unfair to say that she's only one way, but it was really interesting to build a character and work with a character whose evolution from like the first episode to the last episode, you kind of see her harden into this image of herself that she's created, which is this kind of staunch anti-feminist, who has then, built all these, as you put them, unholy alliances in order to fight against, the Equal Rights Amendment, but then also all these other kind of really important issues that continue to be really important regarding social justice, from women in the military to, gay and lesbian rights to, to racial injustice and all these other things that are kind of somehow ended up getting very tied into the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. I don't know if I forget where I started with that question, but
No, I mean, I think, part of it too is that I came in with some knowledge, but learned so much through the show. I know when I was talking to Dory about this event, we were both talking about how much Googling we did while we were watching it, of sort of, who was that? Or, I think for me, one of the questions that kept coming up over and over again was sort of, is that a fictional detail? Is that a real detail? Let me investigate. And, I think it's interesting that you were sort of doing a public service and creating this show. You're really giving people this context that we don't learn about the ERA in our public schools. And a lot of the story is obviously super sanitized, and there are people who are cut out. I think a lot of people in particular, haven't ever met Bella Abzug before. And I'm actually curious if people just want to post in the chat about what characters they were meeting for the first time when they watched this show, because I just think, that focus on these women who have been so erased, that so many people don't know who Shirley Chisholm was, or, really who Phyllis Schlafly was, or what she actually did. And I'm just curious about how you walked that line between wanting to tell the honest story, tell the real truth about what happened, but then also having to fill in the gaps and having to make the story engaging and, consumable. So what were sort of the boundaries that you drew there, and how did you walk that line?
Well, I just want to agree with you that there was so much that I didn't know that I thought I ought to have known. And Jill Ruckelshaus is one of those characters who I one of those historical figures that who's played by Liz Banks in the show. I really didn't know anything about her. I didn't know that there were liberal feminist Republicans in the 1970s. So, having a character like that and being able to devote an episode to her was really, kind of amazing. But to the question of, how it's an extremely meticulously researched project by Davi and the other writers. There were times when we knew that we were kind of collapsing events. For instance, Betty Friedan debated Phyllis Schlafly twice, and we kind of collapsed some things, but a lot of the actual lines are taken from the debate. And same with Donahue. She went on Donahue multiple times, and we kind of collapsed it for story purposes and just to keep things moving, because there was so much there. There's so much there, and there were so many characters that we couldn't really do justice to all of them. But we tried to, keep things moving and keep things dramatically engaged. Trying to think of other things in particular. I'm curious, and the pie incident, I don't know if you guys have seen all the episodes, but the beginning of episode 7, Phyllis Schlafly gets, pied in the face, and her cornea gets scratched, and it becomes this serious injury. And I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up because it is real. And so I think that we, tried to stay as true as possible to the reality, but of course there were things that we didn't know, and dramatic license that was taken to try and understand the characters, particularly in their private moments. But I'm curious if there were certain specific things that you were thinking of where you were curious either if they were real or that they weren't, and are wondering how we walked the line.
Totally. I mean, Patricia just asked if the portrayal of Hamilton, Jordan, and Jimmy Carter was accurate.
That is, I don't know if the way that he was acted was exactly accurate, but I absolutely loved working with that actor, and so did Margot Martindale. He was a really, I thought he kind of, nailed that certain air about him really well, but I don't know how he actually behaved as a human being. But all of that was true. That the fact that that Carter had already decided to fire her before he had this meeting with them, and it came as a real surprise because they had thought that it was a good meeting, and then she's kind of fired immediately afterwards. That was accurate. I don't know who was in the room when she got fired or if those details were accurate, but we also added that kind of a little archival clip right afterwards, which is the real archival clip of the women who were part of who resigned, who were part of the committee, who then resigned, and they said that they resigned because in large part because Bella Abzug had been fired. So we kind of tried to trickle in some of that real archival footage just to, remind people that this is real, that a lot of this stuff really did happen.
Yeah, and I think it was interesting too to see the sort of subplot about Gloria Steinem both facing sort of harassment in the media from men and anti-feminists, but then also internally the struggle that she has to sort of be taken seriously by some of her peers who are maybe, I don't even know, angry at her because she's the rising leader and the star, who think that she's sort of an overblown celebrity. And, I'm wondering sort of where that came from. I know she talks about it sometimes in her books and in her lectures. Did you work closely with some of the folks who were still living to sort of fine tune the portrayals of them?
Not really, to be perfectly honest. There's so much of that movement and that era is documented, and every single one of the women who were portrayed have written at least one book. So there's a lot of material to use to try to get inside the different characters. And my understanding, and I'm not responsible for the writing, but my understanding of it when I was talking to Dave, because of course it's a question that I asked when I came on the project, is, who are the consultants, and are any of the living women part of this project? And, she has the utmost respect for everybody who she is portraying on that, in the feminist movement. But at the same time, I think felt strongly that she didn't want to be tethered to one perspective on the story. And that's, you can see it in the way that the episodes evolve, that it does have multiple perspectives. And she tries to, and it's important to me too, as a filmmaker, even with real people, or maybe especially with real people, to try to understand them as human beings and not just heroes. And so there is a certain amount of, messiness in all of the characters that she portrays. And I hope that the series really does justice to the who these women were and making them whole, complete human beings. And like, for me, that makes them more heroes to see that they struggled with, for instance, in Shirley's episode, they struggled with supporting Shirley wholly and fully when maybe they should have, and it was complicated for them. And, Shirley really felt betrayed. So anyways, I just, that was something I really liked about it. And I think that partly not having one person, because not everybody is alive, not having like the one or two people who still are alive driving how the story is being told was important to Davi.
Totally. And we got sort of two questions that I think both really pigeon off of that, which is sort of how did you navigate wanting to portray them in that context, but also obviously knowing what we know now? Like, how do you portray someone in a period piece without sort of leaning too much on the foreshadowing? Because there's foreshadowing in there, but yeah, you want to stay true to the story. And then also conversely, like, what have some of the reactions been like from folks and their families who are portrayed in the show when they look back?
Mm-hmm. I don't really know the answer to that second one. Unfortunately, I tend not to, and nobody's contacted me personally about it, and I don't know if anything has been publicly written about it. So I don't know the answer to that second part. In terms of the first part, we had fun with some of that, I guess, what's it called? Like dramatic irony. Like, we know more than the characters will ever know over the course of it. And, seeing her putting on that Reagan pin, "Let's make America great again" slogan that was, really his slogan, that having that kind of portend where we are now, those little things, I think we had a lot of fun with that. And the characters, though, we always wanted the acting to feel very, very natural. And so we always tried to make the characters behave as if they knew only what they know, if that makes sense. So tried not to have too much of the 2019, we were making it, view or judgment placed on them, and had them behave how they would have in that moment. We tried to do that. I'm not sure that we always succeeded. We're kind of looking at, especially in the pilot episode, we're looking at somebody who is so kind of entrenched in a certain way of existing as a woman in these male spaces. But, I'm thinking particularly of the scene when she goes into have this meeting in Barry Goldwater's office. And it's kind of, it's the moment in the pilot where you feel like this event, she's basically told, she's the smartest person in the room, clearly. And she's basically like told to go get a pen to take notes because she's the only woman in the room. And it's this moment where you feel like she could just as easily have become a feminist. Like, this event in her life could have just as easily turned her into a feminist as it did into what she ended up becoming, which was, this like complete opposite, like this anti-feminist, even though in her own life, as Belle Abzug said famously, she is like the most liberated woman in America. In any case, that moment was interesting, and we talked a lot about it just on set with, with Cate Blanchett, because you don't want it to feel, does a woman from her background in 1971 get told to get a pen to take notes? Does she feel about it the same way that we would feel about it? And no, she probably doesn't. And we talked a lot about what that is and how it's possible to have an emotional reaction to something and not even be able to put your finger on why you're having that emotional reaction. All you know is that you were in the middle of talking, you're the smartest person in the room, you're the one who deserves to be in there, and you want to hear what those men are saying. Like, you want to hear what's happening in that room while you're having to go fetch a pen. And so, I do think that there's some of that we were playing with, which is, what is our perspective as women in 2019 versus what is the character's perspective as women in 1970.
Right. And, I think, someone does want to know if there is a historical counterpart to Alice.
She was kind of a mix of real life characters, I believe, but really took total liberties with her. Her whole experience down in Houston, which is one of my favorite episodes, where she, accidentally gets high basically and is in this, the women's conference and, trying to navigate that. So it is basically completely fictional, but there was, I believe, a neighbor of the actual Phyllis Schlafly who ended up having, some kind of feminist awakening and opening a NOW office across the street from her husband's law firm in Alton. And so I think that triggered the idea for Davi of creating this character.
Right. I love that. I'm like, I want to meet that woman. Totally want to meet her. And something I think also that it's amazing to be transported into that time, because as you say in the final episode in one of the cards, that was sort of an unparalleled moment for feminist power, right? You see so many feminists who are actively working together on women's equality in Congress, in the streets. They're organizing conferences. They have these budgets. They sort of have more pull than it feels like we might even have now. What do you think made that moment such a powder keg for women's rights? Do you think there's any strings we can pull to sort of bring that energy back as we sort of face another moment of absolute turmoil, that sort of gave way to the 70s originally?
I wish I had a good answer to that. I'd say the only thing that comes to mind is that a lot of these women came to be feminist activists during the civil rights movement, came to it from their participation in the civil rights movement. And it does, I'm very hopeful that there's a renewed energy right now. I do think that I feel a lot of feelings about what's going on right now, and different feelings each day or each moment. But one of those feelings is that is very energizing, and I'm very hopeful that will bring with it a whole lot of people saying, we have a United States to rebuild in a lot of ways, economically and otherwise. And this is an opportunity to not just kind of recreate the same structures that existed before and have failed us so many times. And I think that a lot of people are feeling the same way, which is why there's so much energy and movement right now. And I hope that it can also affect the movement of, women who are still fighting for the same things that those women were fighting for back in the 70s.
Right. And I think it's also just awesome that, Mrs. America is part of an incredible slate of feminist content that we're seeing coming from FX and Hulu, and it's sort of, the documentary about Jane Roe, we see The Handmaid's Tale, all of these shows that are sort of really galvanizing right now. And a lot of them did sort of begin before the election, but have become these, canaries in the coal mine sort of in this moment. And so what was it like working with um, the production team behind the scenes from FX and Hulu and sort of being part of this feminist library of content that they're growing? Are they doing something differently that you think other people should be doing?
You know, to be perfectly honest, this was an FX show and not a Hulu show until after we made it. So we didn't work with Hulu at all. And FX is actually traditionally known as being like a very male-oriented television. And so I think that they have been making a concerted effort in the recent past to not be branded that way anymore. And so I think that we benefited from that also, that just very conscious decision to not want to be associated just with kind of male-oriented television. And also because Kate Blanchett decided to do it. And so when you have Kate Blanchett on board, it's like, all right.
Your secret weapon. Well, and I mean, would you say that you're interested in creating feminist content? I mean, obviously, you worked on Captain Marvel and you helped make Mrs. America happen. Is this sort of the direction you're hoping to take things in?
I don't ever think about my career or my choices as the thing comes first. It comes, and like I feel extremely passionately about it, and I don't always know why. So I haven't made any specific concerted effort to focus on those stories, but those stories have recently grabbed my attention more. And I do think that I have personally, over the course of my adult life, had a real shift in the way that I've perceived myself and my relationship to making movies. And it's gone very much from stop asking me what it's like to be a female filmmaker. I'm not a female filmmaker, I'm just a filmmaker, And when I was in my 20s, it's like I didn't even understand the question. I was a little bit unaware of, I think, like the systems I was part of, and then, I still wish that people didn't have to ask the question, but I'm a little bit more aware of why they need to. And I can't wait till nobody has to, because it's, that, and I do really think that time is potentially much closer than we think it is. But I do feel why that question needs to be asked, and why it needs to be answered, if not like in an interview scenario, like by the work in some way. I don't know. That's all the movies I grew up watching and that I fell in love with as kids. I look back on them now and I'm like, where are the women protagonists? Like, where are the smart, powerful women in those movies? And I wasn't aware of it when I was watching them. I just wasn't. And so I do kind of want to be part of creating content that, had those women as part of it that we never had when we were growing up in a certain way. Like, I think that's important. I think it's important so that our kids aren't still having the same conversations that we're having.
Right. And Eileen just asked sort of, what would your advice be for other women who are trying to break into TV and film?
What would my advice be? I just like, I only, I did it when I was younger just by doing it, just by like making something. And I do feel like there's even more access to the ability to make something. And there are certainly more platforms to put things up on. And so I don't know, I guess my advice would be just do it. Don't wait for somebody else to like open the door for you. Just start making stuff. And yeah.
And I have, well, and that sort of leads me to, I have two other questions that are sort of about your creative process too. One of them is specifically, what is it like to sort of be in this creative partnership with Ryan? How does that feel? How do you navigate it? What's the give and take? And then also just, what does your working life look like?
Mm-hmm. I have worked with Ryan since, I was 19 years old. So I feel like I've literally had more life working with him as a team than not working with him. And so at this point, we're just very just inside each other's creativity, and it's changed over time the way that we've worked together. But what I really appreciate is somebody who I can look at or share something with and just be like, is this bullshit, or or is this real, is this something that's worth kind of exploring? And so it just feels like we're very much on the same team. And I think sometimes in this business in particular, it's good to just have somebody who is like grounded and on your team and helps you decide what's important to fight for. And we've done that well for each other and with each other. And also, I think that we've really been supportive of each other, kind of following their own thing that feels really kind of important and urgent, I guess, whatever that is. And right now, I am living in Brooklyn, and he is still in Los Angeles, about to move to Chicago. It would be the first time that we're not living in the same city since we were young. I have a 2-month-old baby, and he has been on lockdown, quarantining without kids for the last 2 months, and has been feeling extremely creative, and it's kind of been him having his space to be creative. And then there are times when he's been very busy for whatever reason in his own personal life, and I've needed that space to go off and be creative by myself for a little while before we then come together and share the thing and get excited about it as a team.
Totally. That sounds really magical. And do you think that there are sort of system changes that need to take place in order to make more room for women in the industry? You talked about sort of juggling motherhood and your creative career. So are there structures that you can see are missing that would maybe be a boon?
Yes, absolutely. It's so important that we rethink, I think, particularly how production is thought of and structured in our industry. I am, I say, like, I'm here kind of in motherhood mode right now, mostly. And I have somebody who's a partner who's not in fatherhood mode or motherhood mode that it can be working for us. And not everybody has that. And if you're working alone and you don't have a partner who can be your maternity leave or whatever, it's just the idea of maternity leave doesn't make any sense for us, because we're only paid for the time when we're working. People don't, we're freelancers by nature, and there's not And it concerns me that there's not, even in the DGA for the Directors Guild, our union, that, or any union, that I don't believe there's really any safety net, even in terms of health insurance, because you need to make a certain amount of money each year in order to get your health insurance. So I'm thinking about that a lot right now, just because I feel very fortunate to be in a situation where I don't need to worry about that, but I'm thinking a lot about the women who do, and it's not just directors, it's women who work in all departments. And there are kind of petitioning the DGA to change their systems with regards to how you get insured, so that for a period of time when you are would be on maternity leave, that kind of, you get extra months in order to not lose your health insurance during that time. But that just seems so small to me. It feels like there need to be way bigger changes. And I do wonder if figuring out how to do production during, before we have a vaccine for COVID, could somehow open up potential new ways of working that would be helpful for women and working mothers, and really just humans in general. When we were making Captain Marvel, most film days are 12 hours plus lunch, which means once you add in travel back and forth from set and potential overtime, you just never see your kids. On Captain Marvel, we did these 10-hour days that had kind of a walking lunch, so you don't break for lunch, or people break at different times. And it was 10 and 10.5-hour days, which completely changed everything for people, and not just women, but men too got to go home and have dinner with their parents, with their families on most days. I didn't, because I had to stay and keep working after shooting. But it was this is such a better way of working, and it feels like it would. And so that's just some things that are on my mind. Obviously, I haven't worked them all out. It's because I'm just flooding you with things that are incoherent. But
no, they're all coherent because they're all part of that same problem, right? Of there's just so many tinier, larger obstacles that make things harder for women, for people of color, for mothers, for parents. How do you think we make these experiences you're describing, where there was a little more freedom, a little more time, a little more flexibility, how do we sort of make that the norm? Do you have optimism that after COVID, the way things work might change?
To be honest, I don't have a lot of optimism about it, but I do think that I do have a hope, and I do want to find ways to band together and fight for it. And, another one of the things that I learned about on this project, because, it was Fran McDormand famously got up on stage after she won and said, inclusion rider. And I talked to her, I think the day after she said that, and she was like, I didn't really know what it was. She's like, we're still trying to figure out what that means. What does it really mean? And so I was in the middle of making Captain Marvel at that time, and this is the project that I did afterwards. And as we were getting into this project, I learned more about what that can mean. And really, I think the smartest way that idea can be implemented is you make a commitment to finding candidates for every position, finding candidates of color, finding candidates who are women, and you just make that something that you do without even having to think about it. It just becomes part of your way of working. And I do think that things like that can start to make change. I don't know if it's enough. And I don't know if we're going to blow up the way that production is in terms of just making it easier for people who are working mothers or, you know, have different needs at home. But I don't know, I hope that somebody has an idea for blowing that stuff up too, because I'm like ready. I feel like the world is ready. Like we're at a moment where these kinds of changes can be really made and pushed through. And yeah.
Well, and it sort of makes me think too about like the cyclical connection of all of the, like this idea that feminist media and telling these stories can build a movement, can inspire and galvanize people. And also just that as you're talking about this and we talk about things like equity in the workplace, it's like, well, the ERA would be a huge part of giving women and people of color a voice, especially because women of color are sort of the most absent, right, in media, giving them an ability to say, you know, actually the structure of this is inherently discriminatory or holding women back. And Judy had sort of asked if you're planning to use Mrs. America as an advocacy or an educational tool. Is that part of the life of this project that you're hoping for?
You know, I haven't thought about it in that way. I haven't. I do think that it's, you know, we did approach it as something that we were educated by. Like we were educated by the process of making it. So we assumed that other people would end up being educated by it too. But we were just always trying to make it as enjoyable to watch as possible. So it didn't feel like that kind of, you know, medicinal or, you know, important work that you would get that from it just by enjoying the experience of watching it. I don't know, I guess approached it more as entertainment. But I always, oh, sorry, I lost you guys for a second. But entertainment is always more interesting to me when it relates to what I'm thinking about socially.
Totally. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I know we're almost out of time. I don't know if anyone else has any other questions. I definitely got to ask all of mine. I super appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today for a full hour in the middle of everything burning down.
Thank you so much for for chatting. It's been nice to talk to you all, and I hope everyone stays safe and energized.
Yeah, and thank you for creating such an incredibly, could not stop watching this show and just had so much fun watching it, but also learned so much in the process. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Dory.